This week on Theater Talk.
I think that opera would die out if we didn't have singers who were prepared to act and who directors who otherwise wouldn't want to work with them. So, and we would lose our audience.
Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation.
From New York City, this is Theater Talk. I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
And I'm the show's producer, Susan Heskin.
Well, Susan, we're always talking about Broadway on the show, but I'll let you in on a little secret. I would rather be at the opera most nights than I would at a Broadway show. There are a lot of exciting things happening at the Metropolitan Opera House here in New York. And to talk about them and to talk about how he's really shaking up things in the opera world, we are joined tonight by Peter Gelb, who is the head of the Metropolitan Opera. Welcome to Theater Talk. It's very nice to have you.
Thank you for inviting me.
You have brought in a whole bunch of people we know from the Broadway world. Bart Scher, Mary Zimmerman, Richard Eyre from London, and Nick Heitner. This has been a big part of your changing the Met to bring in theater people, Broadway people. Why?
Well, it's not necessarily because they're Broadway people or theater people. It's just I'm trying to bring the best directors. In order for opera to stay vital, to engage a new public, as well as keeping the older public involved, opera has to advance theatrically. And I'm interested in the best directors I can possibly find who obviously have to be interested in this art form, which is, of course, maybe the grandest of theatrical art forms, in that it combines, theater, music, scenery, costumes,
everything,
but on a bigger scale, perhaps, than what most theater goers are accustomed to. So when I was appointed to this position, I said, I had to kind of really move the Met forward very rapidly, and my way of doing that, in part, has been to replenish the repertory. The Met is a rep theater with many different productions during the course of the season. So I escalated the number of new productions each season by double, and made sure that I invited all the directors who I admired, who I thought would want to work at the Met, which was it's not easy. Now it's easier because the directors who have come. There's good word of mouth about working at the Met. So Richard Eyre tells Nick Heitner that it wasn't so bad, or he had a good time, and then Nick Heitner is brave enough to come and try to work at the Met as well. Because before that, there was a great fear factor at working at the Met.
Well, I was going to ask you, were they intimidated by the Met itself, or just the art form of opera, of working in a much grander, bigger scale?
Well, I think it's different fears for different folks. I mean, they're in general. I think the Met had a reputation of being a potentially hostile environment for directors that I think not necessarily deserved, but it was considered to be, because it was known as having a very kind of older audience and a very it was considered to be very conservative.
Right.
And so directors, the best directors, of course, want to believe that their imagination will be unfettered and that they will be free to pursue their creativity, and the really top ones, don't want to waste their time if that's not going to be the case.
Right.
So, in fact, the first year that after I was appointed, while I was waiting, I was sort of in waiting as the general manager-elect, I ran around the world pursuing directors and trying to convince them that the Met would be a place where their creative work would be supported. And also, I mean, there are other reasons, practical concerns about working at the Met, which I can understand, which are, because it is a repertory theater, it's got one of the busiest stages anywhere. It's in constant use, literally, because unlike Broadway, where you rehearse, you have previews, show opens, and then it plays.
Right.
at the Met, we rehearse every day something else.
Right.
So a show opens and then we move on to the next show.
Right.
And we're constantly juggling these different shows in the air. So any given week, we have 4 different shows playing. In the daytime, we rehearse whatever the next opera is that's going to open, whether it's a revival or a new production. And then
Recipe for chaos all over the place all the time.
And then as soon as that rehearsal ends at 2:30 or 3 o'clock, there's this mad scramble to get that night's show on the stage.
Wow.
And set so that when the curtain opens at 8 o'clock, there actually is scenery waiting to be seen. And then as soon as the show ends, and operas are not short, some of them last 3 or 4 or 5 hours sometimes. When the show ends, immediately the night gang comes into play and takes that scenery off and sets up the next morning's rehearsal. So our stage literally is in 24-hour use.
I want to ask you the subject of the theater directors going in, because I talked to a couple of them, and another hesitation sometimes they have is that they feel in the opera it's the singer dominates. That it's the singer who comes in, the great world-famous singer, take your pick, Renee Fleming.
Right.
And they're not really going to be directed because they do these roles all the time, everywhere. And they have the contained performance and they just drop it into somebody else's production and they're not interested in talking to the director. Do you find that to be the case?
Well, I find it to be the case that that's something that I'm battling against all the
Tell
time.
us about that.
And I won't tell you the individual battles or show you my scars, but no, it is absolutely true. I mean, some singers, but those are the singers who have less successful careers these days, will literally, bring their role with them as if it was packed in their suitcase, how they're going to sing a role and think that that's what they're going to do when they arrive at the Met. All I can tell you is that in the case of the new productions that we put on, it doesn't work that way because it's much more complicated and much more diplomacy is required because there are 2 kings of any production. There's the director and there's the conductor. In fact, if you look at posters of operas, the conductor is listed above the director.
Right.
So a stage director who's used to being a dictator has to be willing to work on a much more collaborative basis at the Opera House. The singers, though, are, we don't put singers, I would not cast singers in a new production if I did not think that they could work in the spirit of creativity and new invention that is required, and that they have to be willing to at least consciously be willing to put aside whatever previous ideas they have about a role, or bring those ideas with them, but in the spirit of collaboration. Otherwise, it won't work. And when we, unlike the old-fashioned days of opera, where a conductor and an opera house general manager would cast an opera, I don't cast operas without the director's agreement. Ultimately, what makes a great singer, a great opera singer, is these attributes or talents of singing and acting are merged. And the really great opera singers today are ones who are complete performers, who are singing and acting and are open to direction and are inspired by it.
I'm sure I won't be able to get you out on the ones who still pack the performance and take us around, but can you tell us some of the ones that you admire who are committed to acting and to working with a director, the caliber of a Michael Grandage?
Well, there is a whole generation of singers who are willing to do that, and who are superb. And we're very fortunate because I think it's almost an evolutionary protection for opera that these singers have emerged, because quite frankly I think that opera would die out if we didn't have singers who were prepared to act and who directors who otherwise wouldn't want to work with them. So and we would lose our audience as a result. But in any given season, anyone from Anya Netrebko, who's opening next season.
She's quite a good actress.
She's a wonderful actress, and she's opening next season, and a very believable one. She's opening our next season a new production of Anna Bolena, and the other female star of that is Alina Garancha, who had audiences, I think, in New York, it's safe to say, really spellbound by her interpretation of Carmen in the Richard Eyre production.
Yeah.
So those are two singing together. Mariusz Kwiecień, who's a wonderful Polish baritone who's singing the title role in Michael Grandage's Don Giovanni, is a fantastic actor. Bryn Tervel, who sings Wotan in the Robert Lepage Ring, which we will be completing next season.
Your biggest production to date.
Right. Well, it weighs heavily on my mind. Not just the set that's heavy. It's an awesome responsibility for all of us at the Met to make sure we get it right.
And it's going to be the same set, right, for all of the.
It's the same set, but it's a very talented set.
It moves in flat.
That does amazing things, and for those. Cynical opera goers who believe that one set cannot possibly provide a variety of scenery for all four operas, I think they're in for a surprise.
Because that's been one of the criticisms of it, that, oh, the set is going to be here the whole time, and some people have not liked the set, and they say, oh, God, the rest of the opera is going to be set on the set we don't like.
Well, those people will be disappointed.
Very good.
You're taping some of these operas for television, aren't you?
Well, what we do is,
Yes.
one of the things that I began when
Yeah.
I became the head of the Met was to not only, I wanted to change things artistically the way we're doing with these directors and singers, and but also I wanted to make sure that the Met was sort of broke out of its shell and was much more accessible and available, and that's why we started these live transmissions on opening night to Times Square, and inviting the public in for for dress rehearsals, and our live transmissions into movie theaters, which have been an incredible success story for us and have really brought the world of opera globally, literally together. We this year we're taking 12 Saturday matinee performances that begin at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and transmitting them live in high definition into 1,500 movie theaters that have satellite dishes on their roofs. And we have audiences of up to 250 to 300,000 people in one go, sitting in these theaters in 43 countries around the world, all sharing collectively this experience and applauding their favorite singers at the end of arias as if they were sitting in the opera house.
Yeah.
And it's an extraordinary kind of social and cultural phenomenon that has helped the Met enormously.
Are your ideas, in the way you're trying to change the Met and are changing the Met, are they catching on in opera houses around the world? Are opera producers and the people who run these opera houses watching and stealing from you? Or is it still a very conservative world that doesn't like to change the way they've been doing things for a century?
Well, you know, the Met had been particularly conservative in its approach, and I think that was because it was a gauge of its audience. And you know, I believe that you can't always accept at face value what you think the audience is saying it wants. I believe that you need to try to stimulate and lead an audience, and that involves taking risks and taking chances, but and that's what I'm trying to do with the Met, and so far it seems to be succeeding. Internationally, it's depending upon what country you're talking about, the situation varies. In Germany, for example, there have been German opera houses have long been sort of at the cutting edge of theatrical presentation. In fact, they've gone over the edge, in my opinion, to a place where I wouldn't necessarily want to be.
What's that?
That's where the people are booing the production. That makes no sense.
Well, for example.
It's you know, there are many examples, but you know, taking an opera like Rigoletto and setting it in outer space and having everyone wearing ape suits.
Yes.
That kind of thing. So where the and I think it's sort of it's a case of culture fatigue, where you know the operas have been played for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and directors who don't have really good ideas, you know, come up with anything that will go for shock value.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's much harder, obviously. In the same way, it's much harder for a director of a revival or a new production of Hamlet or Macbeth or Othello to come up with something that is true to the story and still be original and appealing. to do that. And I mean, and that's what the sort of challenge of directing opera is. I mean, directors need to, they shouldn't take on operas unless they are willing to be faithful to the story.
Yeah.
And you know, what's interesting about the Robert Lepage ring, for example, is that many people will come to this ring because of Lepage, because he has his own followers, people who are writing dissertations and things about, you know, his visionary kind of visual approach to everything that he does. And what I was struck by was the number of comments that I received after the first opera of the Ring was unveiled, the Rheingold, by the people who, you know, got the story. I mean, there's so much. One of the difficult parts of Rheingold and the Ring is that it's a very complicated mythological soap opera, and you know, it's to take for granted, which some directors in Germany, I don't mean to pick on Germany, but might the show wasn't aired in Germany anyway.
Well, and they're responsible for Wagner, so
but that, you know, that the idea is they sort of assume that the audience knows everything.
Yeah.
And so,
They're all opera nuts.
so they spend all their time sort of doing these kind of inside jokes, you know, and as we all know, I think that, you know, for art to work, it has to work on multiple levels. I mean, you have to, for an opera to be a successful production, it needs to be sophisticated enough that someone who's seen this piece gets something new out of it,
Right.
who knows the piece very well. But it also has to be possible for a newcomer to get it as well.
The story.
To get the story. The story has to be told. It sounds pretty basic, but I mean, that's sort of my first cardinal kind of rule when I'm engaging a director. I don't ask them if they're going to tell the story. I know ahead of time they are, because I know what they've done.
That's one part. Have you ever had a situation, though, where a director starts to veer in a direction that you think just isn't going to work for your opera house, and do you have the power then to change it?
Well, I mean, theoretically, I have the power to change it.
But
You are God. I mean, the heads of opera houses are gods.
No, the idea of that happening with someone like Nick Heitner or Richard Eyre or Robert Lepage is really unthinkable to me, because they have spent their lives, and you know, and
they have their clunkers too.
They have their clunkers too, but they don't. You know, the difference with opera, in most cases, because we're dealing mostly with stories that have already been written. So usually, when things go awry, it's in a more vulnerable creative situation where it's new work, and where things can really go wrong in the creation of a work that is flawed, and a director not being able to being swamped by that, or not being able to rise above it, or whatever the failure is. In the case of most of the operas that we're putting on, they're new productions of classic pieces, and so it's much less likely, when you're hiring a director who has impeccable taste that he's proven over a career, a track record of great work. It's much less likely that something drastically can go wrong. I mean, I see my role as somebody who is a facilitator for creative talent, and I'm trying to make it, rather than trying to head them off before they go wrong, I try to encourage them to go right by giving them the wherewithal to achieve their ideas. And certainly, I mean, I sit and see most directors, the most creative directors are the ones who are most open to and the most collaborative, and who are the least insecure. And they are the ones who will rise above the type of issues that will come up in a new production at the Met more often than not will be ones of practical concern, where a director will realize that his idea can't work because of the restrictions of the stage and the fact that, you know, the elevator lifts that he wants to use are already being used by another production that's playing the next day. So
very practical,
you know,
reasons why you can't. Yeah.
But the really good directors have a million ideas up their sleeve, and they have solutions.
Yep.
So they figure out ways to get around obstacles, and my job is to help them get around them. And with my team, we have an amazing group of people who work at the Met. We're the largest employer of stagehands in New York City, which is economically not something I'm necessarily proud of, but
it's a good thing you have a big endowment.
But which was not that big. But which I mean, the guys who work at the Met are the hardest working and most professional and dedicated crew you can possibly imagine. They take great pride in their work, and they take great pride in seeing productions become successful, partly in large part through their efforts. And the so I really, you know, the idea that I would tell a director, you know, that they're all wrong is pretty much not something that can happen with the type of directors I'm engaging. And if it did, I probably wouldn't talk about it.
Let me ask you though about the power, your power. You are arguably one of the most powerful artistic leaders in the world running the Met. And your predecessors, people like Joe Volpe, Rudolph Bing, incredibly powerful men who were not afraid to exercise their power. Joe Volpe famously fired Kathleen Battle. Bing had famous battles with Callis. Do you have that kind of power? Do you enjoy having that kind of power? And do you have to be very strategic in how you use it? In other words, do you have to pick the right fights where you show the muscle that you really have?
Well, I don't believe in fighting for the sake of fighting. You know, I am willing to put up with a lot in order to achieve the artistic results that I would like to see.
And this is crazy diva behavior, all the opera cliches we hear about the singers who behave in monstrous ways.
Most singers who behave in ways that first of all, most of the singers at the Met behave wonderfully.
It's because they're afraid of you.
No, I think when singers have problems, it's often because they are anxious or nervous about the incredible pressure that they face. I mean, you have no idea, or maybe you do, but it's hard to imagine the stress that a singer feels. I mean, they unlike Broadway, which has marvelous actors, but they have microphones and amplification, and a singer goes on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera. There are 3,800 seats. It's this huge space which has great acoustics, but they don't have any artificial assistance whatsoever, and they have to go out there and hit high notes and deliver. And it's no wonder that they might sometimes be a little high-strung. So I mean, I do not believe. I think a singer who is anxious and uptight because they want to do well, and who get out of nervousness might act irritably or like a diva. It doesn't. My job is to make that person feel good and want to perform.
So you're not an imperious leader of your opera house, the way one has the sense, Bing was like that. He was the boss.
Well, I'd like to think I'm the boss also, but I make the artistic decisions. I'm not afraid about making decisions, and I do make decisions every day. But the point I'm just trying to make, though, is that I'm trying to get the best out of the performers, and if there is a great artist, I would rather not lose them unless it really reaches a point of diminishing returns.
Did your predecessor, Joe Volpe, give you any key bits of advice when you took the reins?
Well, I've known Joe for many years.
Yeah.
In the 80s, I was producing television programs at the Met, and he was the assistant general manager. So we've known each other for a long time. And certainly, in the transition year when I was preparing to take over as general manager, I studied what he was doing.
You kind of shadowed him, didn't you?
To a certain extent. And together, we worked on some union negotiations that enabled this program of our live transmissions into movie theaters to be possible, because it involved rewriting all of our union deals. We have 16 unions at the Met to allow for that. I have great respect for Joe,
was there anything?
And in fact, I've engaged Joe to be our labor negotiator.
Oh, yes, right.
And he's working with me very closely on fashioning our new union agreements that will hopefully ensure future successful seasons at the Met.
But there wasn't anything from him that you sort of learned, or just how you run such a big organization? He struck me as, I knew him a little bit, and he struck me as being a man who was always calm under most intense kind of pressure.
Well, that's certainly a side of him. I think that I'm not sure he would agree with you that he was calm at all times.
Well, that's the public face that he gave.
But and certainly I try to project an aura of calmness as well. But I think it's impossible for in this job for Joe or for anyone to be calm all the time.
All right. Peter Gelb, a fascinating conversation about the opera. He is the head of the Metropolitan Opera House here in New York, shaking things up, bringing a lot of very, very talented theater people in, and bringing opera to a new generation, which is ultimately what you have to do or it's going to die.
That's true.
Right. Thanks for being our guest tonight on Theater Talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Our thanks to the Friends of Theater Talk for their significant contribution to this production.
Theater Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Lowe Foundation, the Eleanor Naylor Dana Charitable Trust, the Alan S. Gordon Foundation, the Corey and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, Carrie J. Fries, the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency.
We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you and good night.